We're well, good. Thank you, John, for the wonderful introduction. I hope everyone's not too hungover and looking forward to Bash tonight. I am here to talk about distributed teams, and I'm going to start with a story about me. Believe it or not, the person on the left is me. Don't know if you noticed that, but that is me. Many, many years ago, well, sorry, the person on the right, sorry. There you go. The other guy is my best friend, Adam. This is a photo of me from back in 2002. I spent 2 years traveling around the world. That's not really the point of the story. The point of the story, though, is to tell you that when I was traveling, I met lots of people. And that's who I am. I'm a people person. I love speaking to people. I've always been the social butterfly. Later on at Bash, please come and talk to me. I'd love to talk to you. I love talking to people. Always in person. One of my first jobs was as a barman. I love talking to customers. It was awesome. One of my next jobs, I just did this because I'm a designer and I can Photoshop myself onto stuff. One of my next jobs, I worked in a call center. So I just talked to people all day. It was amazing. I actually loved speaking to people. And so that continues into things like Summit. This is me speaking last year. I love speaking to people, sharing stories about work. And this is me talking with Sharif Mansour, one of our awesome product managers. Little known story, failed designer as well. But if you know Sharif, ask him about that. But I love speaking to people. And this continued into how I operate as a person and as a design leader at Atlassian. And so when I moved into management and started running teams, all of the practices that I put into place revolved around meeting, talking, coming together. And one of my favorite early rituals or practices was called fika. Fika is Swedish for coffee and cake, and you come together, have coffee and cake, and you start talking about things. And on Mondays, we'd get together with our team in the Sydney office, and we would talk about design, and we would talk about our weekends, and we would build connections. It was amazing. I loved this ritual. As a designer, we then would put our work on a wall, and we would give each other feedback. If you look closely, there's bananas that we're putting on. Those bananas mean we like things. Just because we're designers, we choose to do those fun little things. But we come together and give each other feedback. The more recent photo of me, sharing some work, team giving me critique, all in person. It was wonderful. And then it also extended into my team rituals. So we want to get together and have a lunch, do dinner, do drinks, do coffee. I loved talking to people, and I loved doing that in person. And it's always really easy when you're in the same office. It's amazing. You can just chat. You can just get together, say, hey, let's meet. And then, in 2014, I had what I can only describe as my oh shit moment. What happened in 2014 was I got my first team that wasn't in the same office as me. They were in Vietnam, in Saigon. This is a photo of the Saigon office. If you look closely, there's Dom and Mike, or better known as Elvis after this morning, I think. But this was the Saigon team. So I got a small team in Saigon, and to be honest, I had no idea what I was doing about how to manage that team. I literally had no idea. And to be honest, I was a pretty shitty manager, to be frank. I was not a very good leader of this team that I had in Vietnam. I made a ton of classic mistakes, and I was lost. I didn't know how to scale my practices to a different location. And it's incredibly hard when people are in a different time zone, a different office location, they come from a different culture. How do you scale your practices? Now, the good thing was that I knew that I had to improve. I knew I had to get better. And this is what the talk is about. It's about that journey that I've been on since being a pretty shitty manager for teams in different locations to where I am today. Now, before we get into some of the things I want to share, let's set some context. I want to set some context about my existing team, the existing setup, and also about remote work in general. So this is my team today. I have 55 designers. They're spread across multiple locations. So we have 2 offices in Sydney. So they're not even in the single office in Sydney, those 55 people. I have people in Austin, Texas. I have people in Mountain View. And I have people spread across home offices across North America and Canada. So pretty much everywhere. Multiple time zones, multiple locations, different cultures, lots of different difficult things to deal with. Now, before we talk about how I work with that team, I want to set some context around remote teams, because one of the common misconceptions is that there's a single one-size-fits-all when it comes to remote. And when you mention remote to many people, they just think of they have a particular vision in their head, like lots of people working from home offices. But how I think about remote teams is there's 4 different types of remote teams. So you might have a remote-friendly team. This is where you allow team members to work remotely. You hire specifically in remote locations, but you generally work on the same time zone. So this is how Trello operates. So Trello does have a headquarters in New York, but employees can work from anywhere across North America and Canada, so long as they have about 4 to 6 hours crossover with the New York office. This is a remote-friendly team. Then you have the occasional remote worker. So somebody who, once in a blue moon, may go and work from a different office. You are probably all an occasional remote worker today and at this conference, because I'm sure you're sending emails back to colleagues in your office, and I'm sure you're also potentially taking some calls. So you might have an occasional remote worker or remote team. Then you might have what's called selective. So you do not hire remote people. You're not remote friendly. But you will allow specific people to work remotely. So for example, you might have a really tenured or experienced employee, and they move, and you decide to let them work remotely. But you won't specifically hire anyone remote. And then this is probably what I'm going to talk about most, a distributed team. So a distributed team works across multiple time zones, multiple locations, and they're generally all in different geographies. And this is what I'm going to talk mostly about today, because Atlassian and myself with my team, we're a distributed team. Now, some further context. So Stack Overflow in 2017 ran a study, and over half of engineering respondents said that remote options were a top priority when thinking about their next role. So it's huge. Over half of people surveyed wanted some form of remote option when looking for a new job. So for hiring, this is incredibly important as you look to scale your teams. Now, has anybody, raise your hands, has anybody lost a team member because they moved to a different location and you couldn't support them? Awesome, yeah. Sucks, right? You've spent all this time hiring people, you onboard them, they've got a bunch of knowledge of your business and your market, and then you lose them because they move to a location that you don't have an office in and you can't support them. So that sucks. Going back to Trello, even though they have an office in New York, 80% of Trello applicants are remote, so they're wanting to work from a remote home office. This means for Trello that they can 5x our applicant pool with remote offerings. What this means to the business is they can close those open headcount faster, and they can get to building customer solutions much, much faster. So it's incredibly powerful if you offer remote and remote-friendly options from a hiring perspective. If you look at Atlassian, we're aiming to 3x our distributed team members over the next 3 years. So this is, and most companies I would state are similar. As the workforce is changing, and as the environment in which we all work continues to change, I think people will want remote options. We did an internal survey at Atlassian, and over 95% of employees wanted us to think more deeply about how we could better support remote workers. And again, I think this is not just Atlassian, this is the broader population of companies. Again, Stack Overflow survey, that same survey, over 60% of engineers reported working remotely at least 1 day a month. So people are already doing that. And 11% say that they're already full-time remote, or almost all the time. And so you can't ignore this topic. You can't ignore the changing needs of your employees and the changing wants that will happen in the future. And this is a wonderful illustration from Chris. Give him a shout out on the Trello marketing team. But this is a video conference call. Okay? So you log onto your laptop, maybe use Zoom or Blue Jeans or something. Raise your hands again. Who's been on a video conference call in the last month? Yeah. So the news flash is most of you are already working with distributed teams. It's already happening. Again, show of hands. Who thinks they're doing that distributed or remote work really well? Okay, one gentleman up the front, awesome. So that's hopefully what I'm going to talk to you about in the next kind of 25 minutes is my own personal lessons and journey as I've gone from being someone who had no idea what a remote team was or a distributed team to where I'm at today. And I'm going to share some practical tips, really, about how you can adopt or you can work more effectively with your distributed teams. And those themes are around being open and human, meetings or no meetings, and then some tools which are incredibly important. So we'll start with being open and human. This is a wonderful quote from Ron Garan. I don't know where he got this, by the way, because he's an astronaut, so I don't know how he came up with this quote. I think our marketing team would like to claim this, but he says, open collaboration encourages greater accountability, which in turn fosters trust. And I think this is an amazing quote because Atlassian talks about working openly, but that openness leads to that greater accountability and then trust. And I think this is inherently very true. But how do you do that with a distributed team? How do you actually create trust when you're not in the same office and you can't talk to them? This is one of the first things that I do that I always share with people who are working with distributed teams. This is a very humble Confluence page, but this Confluence page is essentially a manager README. So it says working with me. On this page, I list my life history, where I was born, where I grew up, my family, my work history, where I came from, my beliefs as a manager, my beliefs as a designer, and then things that I enjoy doing outside of work, playing football, listening to music, and then information about my family. The reason that I share this is that usually this information you would get when you're in the same office and you bump into people and you just talk to people. But if you've got a distributed team, how do you do that? And so I create this page, and then everybody that comes into my organization, I ask them to read this, because then when we do meet for the first time on video conference, we can have a more sensible conversation, and maybe they'll have learned a little bit about me. And so as you scale your teams in different locations, they need to understand who you are as a colleague and who you are as a leader. The next thing, again, is a very humble Confluence page. Every single week, I share what is top of mind for me on a Confluence page. It's all open. Nothing's locked down here. The reason I'm sharing what's top of mind is I want my team to understand what I'm thinking about, the problems that I'm trying to solve, how I'm approaching a particular problem, the things that are on my mind, because I don't get to bump into them every single day. And it's not appropriate to necessarily just brain dump that into a Slack channel. And again, I'm just being open and accessible with them every week because I want their help and I want them to understand what's important to me. The last humble Confluence page, there won't be any more in this section, is my office hours. So with a distributed team, time zones are incredibly hard. And as a manager, my calendar is not pretty. It's a calendar Tetris. But I want to be able to meet with as many of people in my team as possible who are not my direct reports. And so every month, I have a set block at the same time of 4 hours where anybody can sign up and talk to me. And they can sign up using this page, and it's just simply known as office hours, because it's a regular time where people can come and talk to me, and I can be more open and accessible as a leader. I've mentioned this a little bit, but when you're in the same office, the water cooler is incredibly important. It's an incredibly important cultural tradition. You learn culture, you learn about your teammates, you get together and make tea and just talk about your weekend. You get together and learn about the people that you're working with. And Sean, if you saw the opening day keynote, he talked about this. Teams that know each other and build trust, they work more effectively together. But again, how do you create this water cooler when you're in totally different time zones and you don't get to bump into each other? Now this is obviously our Slack channel for our design platform team, which is spread across all those locations. And this little team ritual or practice has actually been one of the biggest things that we've done that's had the biggest impact for us. All we simply do is every single Monday, everybody in the team shares a single photo from their weekend. And we then put a little bit of context around it, and then people just share that in a stream in our Slack channel. What's nice about this, if you highlight the emojis, it builds connections. It builds culture. People understand each other a little better. And it also builds little threads. So this is Sarah. She's in Austin at the top. She shared the Lego architecture that she's building on the weekends, which is awesome, by the way. But then Bradley, who's in Sydney, he then commented on it, and they had a little back and forth. Bradley and Sarah, I think, have only ever met once in real life, but they're now building connections amongst each other as a team, and they're telling stories. The interesting thing about this is we actually failed epically with this when we started. It seems simple, right? Sharing a photo, how do you fail? How we failed, and I think this is important, the Sydney team would come in on a Monday and they would share their photos. Now, for those who know the time zone, Sydney Monday is US Sunday. And so what would happen is the Sydney team would share their photos, and then on Monday in the US, we would come in as the US team, and we'd see this long scroll of photos and comments and things that we had not participated in. So it actually drove a bit of a wedge between us because it emphasized the time zones. But how we tweaked this ritual to get around that was simply the US team would start on Monday around midday sharing their photos, which is Tuesday morning. And then the Sydney team would also engage. But that meant that we could all as a team participate in that ritual together, which was incredibly important. So you don't want to drive silos. You want to create engagement. Now this is a similar setup, but this is with the Trello team. If you remember earlier, I talked about going for team lunches. I love going for team lunches with my team. But how do you do that if everybody is in their home office? How do you actually do that when people are just in their home office? What Trello does, instead of having a quarterly team outing, which I'm assuming is very common for people, we just give our staff $50 a quarter to go and do something with their friends and family. The ask, though, is to then share back a photo of what you did with your friends and family onto this Trello board. Because again, you're then creating connections and shared meaning between each other. And it's an incredibly simple thing to do, but again, you start learning more about the people that you're working with. Now this is a very long quote, but I included it because it's such a wonderful quote. This is a quote from Tony Starr. He's one of the content designers in Sydney. After we started doing these photos, he shared this in the room. He said, and I'll read the quote, he says, "These weekly update photos are wonderful. The connections and empathy that comes with it, not to mention the joy of sharing in your colleagues' lives, is immeasurable. It's the best thing we've done as a distributed platform team yet." And it was incredibly cheap to do. Hey team, let's share a photo. Like that was, and it was so simple, but it's created these amazing connections between people. So to kind of wrap up this section, do work openly. Humanize yourself as a leader if you manage teams, but also build team connections. But the key here is this doesn't happen accidentally. You have to be very deliberate and you have to make a very conscious effort to do this. It takes time. It's incredibly hard. You have to iterate. Now, meetings or no meetings, you'll come to discover I hate meetings. I actually do not like meetings. But since I've started working with a distributed team, I have two principles that I work by when I think about meetings. Number one, question everything. Does this really need to be an in-person meeting to get to the same outcome? Like really question everything very hard. The second principle is to schedule thoughtfully. And I'll explain what that means in a moment, but you've got to make the most of your time zones. But let's look at question everything. Now, I used to be a consultant for my sins before Atlassian. And when I was a consultant, I would charge myself by the hour. Overpaid. But we charge ourselves by the hour to our clients. And I would charge my team by the hour. What I realized was that when we had a meeting with our clients, it wasn't an hour-long meeting. If we had 5 of our consultants in the room, it was 5 hours, because that's how we charged. We charged for 5 hours worth of work. And so I started rethinking how I thought about these meetings. And so if you remember 55, that's the number of designers I have in my team. If I had a team meeting for an hour every single week, that's 55 people, is 55 hours. The question you should ask yourself is, am I getting like 40 hours worth of, that's one person's entire week, am I getting that much value out of that meeting? The answer is usually no. The question you might have, though, is you might say, well, you probably wouldn't have a team meeting with 55 people. That's a lot. What about if you just did it with your leadership team? So my leadership team is about 10 people, roughly. 10 people is equal to 10 hours. So again, a quarter of a person's work week for a single hour-long meeting. So when you're working with distributed teams, really rethink how you think about meetings. Don't just auto-think, okay, let's get a meeting. Let's get all 10 people in the room. It may not be the most effective way to solve your problem. So how I rethought, though, these team meetings, again, a humble Confluence page, instead of having a weekly team meeting, I collate information that I want to share with my design organization onto a page, and every 2 weeks, I share that with the team, and I call it an asynchronous team meeting. What this does is it means that I have an avenue to share important updates with my team every 2 weeks. It also importantly means that they can consume that content at a time that is convenient to them, wherever they are around the world. They're not forced at Monday at 10 a.m. to come to the team meeting. They can consume this at whatever time they want around the world. And I also use it as a chance to build culture and connections and relationships across the team. You'll notice, I'll scroll the page in a second, but you'll notice that section, Meet the Team, 0, that's Chris. He's the design manager for Trello. Every 2 weeks, I change the person and meet the team. And they write a little bit about themselves. And I'll scroll that now. And what you'll see is people then engage with that content. They learn a little bit about Chris, they comment, and then they get on to the update. So you can go down and see what I'm reading, things that are happening in the design organization, things that are happening at Atlassian. And again, they can read and comment at whatever time is convenient to them. It's a much more effective way of sharing information with my team. So, schedule thoughtfully. If you work across time zones, you have to be really thoughtful about when you schedule your meetings. So for me, I work with the US and Australia. Every single meeting that I have with people in the US, I schedule before 2 p.m. The reason I do that is because 2 p.m. is roughly when Australia comes online. That's 8 a.m. the next day. And so I want to optimize the 2 p.m. onwards time for meetings with Australia. I don't want to clog them up with just local in-person US meetings because I can do them before 2 p.m. The other thing that I'll always do, if you work across time zones, and especially with Sydney, it's very easy to get pulled into working late every night because Sydney comes online. My colleague, Steve, who's in the audience, he mentioned this to me when I moved to America. He said, it's really easy to get stuck into working late every single night because that's when Sydney's online. So for me, though, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I don't take late meetings. I leave at 5 and I go home and I spend that evening with my family. I have dinner with my kids and I bath my kids and put them to bed. But on Tuesday and Thursday, I work late. I come in later in the morning, and then I'll generally take meetings to 7:30, 8 p.m. at night. Well, what that does is it's fairer on my family. They understand that Tuesdays and Thursdays I will be a bit later, but the other days they can count on me being home. Having that work-life balance when you're working with distributed teams is incredibly important because you get sucked into when the other time zone is actually online. I always chuckle at this. I don't know whether other people find this funny. If you're working in an agile software team, you're probably doing daily or weekly stand-ups. The tradition that I've seen over the 5 years has been to include the remote team member by wheeling in an iPad on a weird stick or a TV. Like you can see the TV in the middle of the stand-up. I find that incredibly awkward, and I just don't think it's incredibly effective personally. Rethink the medium. Stand-ups are important. How can you get the same value out of a different medium? We use Slack. There's a bunch of stand-up bots on the market. This is just one, Stand-Uply. rethink, because you can get the same value. Monday at 10 a.m. is our stand-up. You can do that via Slack. You don't have to wheel someone in awkwardly onto an iPad. Now, so you're probably thinking, this is all well and good, Alastair, awesome, but we have to have some meetings at some point. And sadly, you do. Now, this, I'm sure would look familiar to most people, plays out across the world, a meeting with multiple locations. This is the design leadership team that I am part of. The design leadership team is in Sydney, Australia, the US, and in India. Now, because of that, the majority of people are actually in Sydney. So you'll see 3 or 4, or you could get up to 6 people in a single conference room in Sydney, and then you would have a bunch of people at the top who are remote. Pretty familiar? I'm guessing this is pretty familiar for most people. I used to be part of that group in Sydney. I moved from Australia to Mountain View about 18 months ago. And when I moved, I realized when I started dialing in remotely, I was the only person in Mountain View, just how ineffective and inefficient that meeting was. Because what would happen, the people in the meeting room in Sydney would have side conversations, and they'd talk across the meeting. And they weren't doing that maliciously, but that's just what happens when you're in a room with people. And as a remote team member, it was really hard to interject in the conversation. How do I sort of put my hand up? It's a bit awkward on Zoom. You're like sitting there going, oh, me. And so to be honest, for about a month, I checked out of this meeting. I was not a very good employee. I checked out of the meeting. It was super inefficient for me. I didn't get any value out of it, and I just didn't contribute, to be honest. But after about a month, I was like, look, I need to stop. I'm not living my own personal values. I'm not living our company values. I need to actually try and get to a better solution. So I asked the leadership team if they would all agree to dial in remotely from either their own meeting room or from their desk. And they agreed, which was awesome. So this is then what the meeting looked like. Now, you're probably thinking, wow, that looks awesome, great. But, and sorry to my colleagues who are in the audience, this is the bit where it gets a bit uncomfortable for them. This is Karen and myself in the bottom corner. We're in the US. Now you can just shout out. What do you notice? What does anyone notice about Karen and me? Anyone? No? Yeah, it's dark. I heard that. So there's a few things. It's dark. You can tell by the lights. We're both at home. And we're both dialed in from our laptops. And that's because it's around 8 p.m. on Tuesday night. That's one of the days that I work late. Now, same exercise. What do you notice about my awesome colleagues? Anyone? Yeah. Anything else? Correct. They're not looking at the camera. Anything else? Sorry? They all look tired. Well, yeah. It's stressful Atlassian. So there's a few things. They're all in an office because it's a different time of day, which is fine, but they're all using the physical hardware to dial into the meeting. What that means is they are then working on their laptop, and they're not looking at the camera. And I can tell you, at 8 p.m. on a Tuesday night, as I looked at my colleagues not looking back at me and doing work, I was pretty pissed off. To be frank, because I'm like, it's Tuesday night, it's 8 o'clock. I don't want to, this is not the optimum time that I want to be on a meeting, and at least you could pay attention, please, friends. And so I shared this in our Slack channel with them. I was not popular. What you're seeing here, though, in both these scenarios where there's a central meeting room or where people are not using their laptop to dial in, is a phenomenon called presence disparity. And I'm going to read this. So the presence disparity is the difference in presence that collaborators experience due to physical, contextual, or psychological circumstances. It's often the effect of presence disparity is an unequal ability to participate in the collaboration. Okay? So it's definitely unequal ability to participate in the collaboration in both those scenarios. What this leads to, this is one of my design managers, Chris, says this really succinctly. Presence disparity leads to poor communication, low engagement, and erosion of trust in distributed teams. And this is true. This is very true. I was not super trusting of my teammates on that Tuesday night. So this is what the meeting looks like today, I'm happy to report. All dialed in from Zoom, all dialed in from our laptop cameras, because it levels the playing field. Look at the FaceTime, and I don't mean FaceTime that we're getting with each other. We're all engaging and participating in the meeting. So FaceTime matters. If any of your team members are remote, level the playing field and have everybody dial in from your camera. The details matter. So to wrap up that section, the best meeting is no meeting at all. Can you achieve the same goal using a different medium? But when meetings have to happen, make them meaningful. Be thoughtful about them. Use some of those techniques I just shared with you. Now, last section, probably the most practical, tools, tools, tools. The first one, again, I laugh at this one. This is a joke blog post internally from 5 years ago, titled Blog Post, My Blog Post. The reason I put this up, though, is because it has 120 comments. 120 comments. It just illustrates my point that I want to make here. So let's imagine you're working and it's the US day. You publish a page, and then or your colleagues published a page, and then you put a bunch of comments on them. Cool, I commented on it. You wait overnight as Sydney come online, and they tap away, put a bunch of comments on your page, and then they go to bed. Okay? So there's now 20 comments, and your frustration is rising because you're going back and forth on a page. And then you put another bunch more comments on there. So there's 85 comments. What do you think's happening here? There's frustration. There's nothing wrong with commenting on Confluence. It can move work forward tremendously well. Same with Slack, with chat applications. You can move work forward really effectively. But if you start getting into deep threaded comments, you have to know when to raise the bandwidth. This is a quote from Mike Knoop, who's the co-founder of Zapier. He's got a team of over 100 people who are fully remote. And what he means by raising the bandwidth is, if you see, he uses the Slack analogy, he's like, if you see 7 people typing in your Slack channel, or if you've had multiple threaded comments, maybe just jump on a video call, because you'll probably solve it faster. And so that's really key. So using the medium or the tools more effectively. The next tool is InVision, a design tool for prototyping. Can be used by anybody, though, to prototype things. There's a quote, I wrote an article a few years ago about prototyping. Again, many of you working in agile software teams, just like a picture paints 1,000 words, a prototype can paint 1,000 user stories. You can go and grab that article if you want. There's a URL at the bottom. But a prototype can be incredibly effective when you're working across distributed teams to communicate something really quickly. We've just released a Jira integration with Google Sheets. I definitely recommend you go and download that if you're working with a bunch of issues in Jira and you want to manipulate them in Google Sheets. But this prototype on the right that I'll just roll, it's just the interaction. You click on the hamburger menu, you click on the drop-down, okay? But then you can comment on that, and the engineers commented on that. Okay, cool, nice and simple. This is an incredibly effective way to communicate something quite complex that could take many, many issues and many, many tickets. My favorite, collaborating in person at a whiteboard using Post-it notes. As a designer, we obviously love Post-it notes. But how do you recreate this? How do you recreate this medium, or when you're working with teams in different locations? There's a few different digital whiteboarding tools out there now. There's RealTime board, Mural, which is the example I'll share, but it's a digital whiteboarding technology. What that looks like, lots of colored Post-it notes. And if you look in the bottom right, you can see how large that canvas is, and I'll just scroll that. So it's a really large canvas, and you can get lots of information on that. And you start to recreate that whiteboard, that physical whiteboard. You can go a step further, though, with Mural, because you don't have to work on it on your own. Again, if you look at the avatars at the bottom, and then when I roll the movie, you'll see different cursors come in. So you can collaborate together in real time on a very large canvas, on a very large whiteboard. So you can start recreating the physical office environment using some of these tools. And then lastly, getting really pro, is you can mix the tools. So this is the Trello team. In the top, you can just see their heads. They're on Zoom. And then, as I roll it, somebody's sharing their Mural, and they're collaborating in real time using Zoom and using Mural. So they're starting to mix these different tools so they can work together across multiple time zones. Now, these tools are awesome, but to wrap up that section, tools are just tools. They can't magically change how you work. They can't. But if you use them thoughtfully, you can have a really huge impact. Like, you really can make those tools really recreate the office environment and work really effectively across oceans. So I'm going to wrap up with a few parting words. Don't think about necessarily remote first. You don't have to think about that. I'm going to scrub that out. Think about how you can make your existing practices more remote friendly or distributed friendly. There are small things that you can do to have a really, really major impact. Now you need to iterate, iterate, iterate. Nothing I shared with you just now, we magically got right on the first example, first time we did something. As you can see, by asking my colleagues to go fully remote, we had to iterate on that because they dialed in from the meeting room software and it didn't really work. People were still not present in that meeting. Linked to that, the devil is in the details. If you look at that photo sharing example, that had the opposite impact when we started it. It drove wedge between us because it was very clear that the time zones were different between Sydney and the US. But making a very small change to that had a really huge impact. And this is the last slide, this is probably the key point. Every interaction is an opportunity to reinforce how much you care about our distributed teammates. And I do truly mean that. Show people that you care by being thoughtful about how you manage them when they're across different time zones and different locations. And with that, thank you very much for listening. I hope you have a wonderful rest of Summit. Thank you.